as I end my presentation, I had a few more things to. Well, let me just, before I conclude, let me just say this. You see, there is a danger of, it is always necessary to look to history for lessons, to look to the history of Islam, as well as the historical experience of other religions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, because these are the religions closest to us, for lessons. I mean, when it comes to Christianity, obviously an important lesson is how Europe in the 16th century managed to break away from the rest of the world in terms of its rapid pace of economic development and political reforms. And Christianity and Protestant version of it played a very important role in the rise of capitalism, in the rise of educational institutions, in the rise of the various political institutions that later were to form to make up the democratic system. So there's much for us to learn from that. And Christian theology underwent fundamental changes which had a direct impact on the development of a sense of competition, a sense of diligence, hard work, methodical life, more ascetic life that did not result in the believer turning his or her back from the world, but working in the world, which was an ethic very much different from that of Catholicism. So there are very important lessons for us to learn. When it comes to the Jews, of course, the fact that maybe this was already alluded to by Sheikh Zaidil, the Jews, if you look at the 19th century, many of the great thinkers, philosophers, psychologists, sociologists, writers, novelists in Europe were Jews. And that is not a coincidence. It has something to do with the great rabbinical tradition of learning that many of the Jews, even if they were secular, went through. The great sociologist Emil Durkheim had a Jewish background. He was not a religious Jew, but he was a product of the rabbinical tradition of education. And this is again something that Muslims can learn from, especially since we do have a similar tradition, the madrasa tradition. Only problem is our tradition has become ossified. So that is also an area that we can learn from as far as the Jews are concerned. But having said that, it is very important that we don't neglect our own tradition. And the danger of looking at Islam through the lens of Protestantism or through the lens of Christianity is that we would tend to neglect our own self-understanding of our problems. You know, what I'm saying is, we learn from others, but we must be conscious of how we have understood ourselves in the past, and we have to be conscious of the fact that we should be seeing or viewing our problems from our own perspective rather than from the lens of others, because the lens of others may distort. And I'd like to give you a very simple example of this, because if I don't give you an example, it would seem that I'm being perhaps xenophobic or being, you know, particularistic. I would like to give the example from the Hindu religion. Now, this illustrates the danger of looking at one religion through the lens of another. You see, when the Dutch came to Southeast Asia, when they came to Java and they came to Bali, they identified the religion there, which when they saw, of course, they saw Muslims, they identified that as Islam. But those who were not practicing Islam, they identified that religion as Hinduism. Now, the people in Bali in the 16th century, in the 17th century, never called themselves Hindus. This is because there wasn't such an idea of Hinduism. And this is because in India itself, there wasn't a religion called Hinduism. In India, there were several religions, and I'm not talking about Judaism and Christianity and Islam. These three religions were in India, for centuries. But apart from Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there were several other religions, several other communities, religious communities. Some of these communities worshipped Shiva, some worshipped Vishnu, some worshipped Brahma, and so on and so forth. The Indians themselves never conceived of these different religious communities as belonging to one religion. And there was no term Hinduism or any other term that unified these different religious communities. The idea that there was a single religion that encompassed the different communities worshipping these different deities was a creation of the Europeans. This is recorded. And the fact, the proof that that this was a European creation is that the Muslim scholar Al-Biruni from the 11th century, when he went to India, he spent 13 years in India. The term Hinduism doesn't appear once in his work. His work was a study of the religions of India, and he says very clearly in his study that this is a study of the religions of India. And he's not talking about Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. He's talking about what today we call Hinduism. But when the Europeans went to India, they looked at the religions of India through the lens of Christianity. Just as in Christianity you have different sects and denominations, they assumed that what they found in India, worshippers of Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, and so on and so forth, these are merely sects within one religion. Even the name Hinduism was given by them to that religion. Because the Arabs used the term Hind or Hindi or Hindu to refer to the people, not to a religion. But it is the Europeans that christened the Hindus Hindus. Right? If I may use what's the term, as a pun? So now, if all there was to that was a misunderstanding, no damage is done. But the problem is, the British went on to colonize India. So this misunderstanding became a concrete reality. Because when they colonized India, they actually created Hinduism. For example, when the British started Hindu temple construction funds, or the Hindu Endowment Board, as they had in Penang and in Singapore, Hindu Endowment Board, right? I think in the early days it was the Hindu and Muhammadan Board or something. So once they start to build institutions such as the Hindu Endowment Board or Hindu Temple Construction Fund, gradually the people whom they are referring to as Hindus gradually see themselves as Hindus. They internalize that idea, and Hinduism becomes a reality lived and experienced by the Hindus themselves. So here you see the danger of a distortion, how it affects a whole community. Right? So this is what I know about the danger of looking at one religion through the lens of another. And this is why I'm saying that we need to be cautious when we talk about this whole idea of Protestantization of Islam. I think it is fair to say, and I would like to conclude, it is fair to say that as we deal with the problem of reform, the goal is not to Protestantize and not to see ourselves after the image of the Protestant Reformation. Neither is the goal to reject completely lessons that we could learn from the experience of other religious traditions. In particular, in this case, we're talking about the Protestant Reformation. But the idea, of course, is to find what the Muslims always regard as the middle path, the path between extremes. Now, as we look for this path, we need to be seriously studying the ideas of reformers, both outside and within the Malay world. And there's so many of them. Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi was mentioned. You have HOS Cokro-Minoto from Indonesia, who was living in the first decades of the 20th century, who fought against the Dutch, who promoted the idea of Islamic socialism. And you have many other examples from the Malay Peninsula and from Sumatra, from Java, from other parts of Indonesia. These need to be studied seriously, and we haven't begun to embark on these serious studies in Malaysia. We also need to study the experiences of other countries. Now, in fact, I think the MC mentioned, she mentioned something about democracy earlier on, and that that reminded me of this point, that today, unlike 50 years ago, you have at least 4 Muslim countries that are showing 4 different paths to democracy. You have Morocco. I don't know much about Morocco, so I can't say too much about that. You have Turkey, which has come a long way from the days of Kemalist dictatorship to a more Islamist style democracy. You have Indonesia, which made a very rapid transition to democracy after the fall of Suharto, unlike the gradual process that has been taking place in Turkey. And you have Iran, which took a revolutionary path, established a democratic system with full of problems. I mean, it's a system that is democratic in name, but very much a abused system. I think what is important about the Iranian case is that 30 years after the revolution, the democratic culture is developing, even if the system itself is not working properly. So you have different parts of democracy, and Malaysia is one. I think I mentioned 4, but I think I actually 5 or 6. Malaysia is one of these paths, right? Not a revolutionary path like Iran, not a path that Indonesia or Turkey took. Indonesia and Turkey started out as authoritarian or dictatorial regimes. Malaysia started out as a democratic country, but it seems to be, having all kinds of obstacles along the way. 30 years ago in Turkey, the Turks said, look at Malaysia. When the Turks were, under military regime, they said, look at Malaysia. The Turks were under military, secularist regime. A secularist regime that was very hostile to Islam. The Turks were saying, look at Malaysia, a progressive Muslim country, economically progressive, but true to its Islamic values. Today the Turks are saying, don't be like Malaysia. Because they're saying, they're looking at all these weird things that are happening in this country. Like some years ago, banning fatwa against yoga and a few other things, which all point to the growing influence of extremism in this country, right? So what I want to conclude with is a few points. What are the greatest dangers to Malaysian society today? First of all, Muslim extremism. In particular, Wahhabism and Salafism. And along with that, legalistic thinking that reduces our problems to rules and regulations. For example, segregation of the sexes. There was an incident recently, a few weeks ago, about not allowing women to cut hair, segregation, in other words, in hair and dressing salons. And I think in Kelantan. And this, points to this larger problem of an obsession with sexuality. hudud laws against adultery also points to this obsession with sexuality. There was another issue. Oh yes, in Kedah, about not allowing non-Muslims to have live music for their, I think, connection with Chinese New Year celebrations. Right? This is another example. But you know, the larger problem is this: the notion of an Islamic state and the role of Islamic law, as understood by people who promote the idea of Islamic state, both among people in Barisan and UMNO, as well as people in the opposition and PAS, is extremely problematic. And there's been no real debate in this country about it. Right? And you will see that there isn't much difference between UMNO and PAS, except that UMNO gives excuses. UMNO's excuse is that we can't have an Islamic state because we are a multiracial society. And we have 40% non-Muslims, so we cannot have an Islamic state. The real point, the correct point, I think, is that we can't have an Islamic state because an Islamic state is not good even for Muslims. And when I say that, I don't mean that Islam is not good for Muslims. I mean that the conception of the Islamic state, which is a modern idea, and it's a modernist idea, is a chaotic idea. Because you will notice that the proponents of the idea of Islamic state are mainly talking about law, and they're mainly talking about hudud laws. They're mainly talking about criminal law, right? The kind of state that they envisage is a horrible state. It's a state that is presided over by a punitive God, not the God of the Sufis, not the God of of Jalaluddin Rumi or Hamza Fansuri, or another God of love, the God of the early missionaries who brought Islam to Southeast Asia, who brought Islam to the Malay world, the Islam of the Sufi tradition. That understanding of, and those Muslims never talked about an Islamic state. They didn't talk about an Islamic state because for them, what was necessary was to live in a society that allowed you to live according to the rules and the laws of Islam. It's like Turkey today. 2 years ago in Turkey, a survey was done, a very large survey, asking Turks, religious Turks, not secular Turks, asking religious Turks about whether they wanted to live in an Islamic state. Only 7% said they wanted to live in an Islamic state. The majority of religious Turks do not want the state to administer Islam on their behalf. They want the freedom to administer Islam on their own. They don't want the state to decide on religious matters. They want the state to give them the freedom for them to decide on Islamic matters. So being against an Islamic state is not to be secular, or is not to be against Islam. Muslims really need to understand that. In this country, Muslims feel that if they're against an Islamic state, they're not being true to Islam. But they have to understand that the whole notion of an Islamic state actually is a very modernist idea. Anyway, so this idea of an Islamic state, I think, and the whole thinking behind what constitutes the state in Islam and how Islam is to be brought into modern life is something that needs to be debated and discussed, and it is not being done so in this country because of the manner in which, obviously, because of the manner in which Islam is politicized. And if you look at the documents of the past, more than 10 years ago, the government issued a document about Malaysia being an Islamic state, and they referred to a work by, I think, a 10th century Muslim scholar, Mawardi, Ahkam Sultaniyah, the rules of government, in which they derived the traits of the Islamic state from this 10th century work. But this 10th century work, it talks about hudud laws, It also discriminates between Muslims and non-Muslims. It also subjects non-Muslims to hudud laws. So it's very problematic to use the Ahkam Sultaniya of Mawardi as a basis for developing the notion of an Islamic state. And this is the government, this is not PAS. Of course, PAS has its own problems, as bad as the government, if not worse, right? I mean, early 1980s Amanat Haji Hadi, which declares has many problematic statements about Malays who don't follow their way, right? And then the whole idea of takfir, kafirkan fellow Muslims, right? And I think these views and these statements have not been withdrawn by PAS. So I'm going to end just in 1 minute. So I was referring to the dangers that Malaysia faces today. So one is Muslim extremism, and this is growing. It is creeping, and I can give you a lot more examples of many other indicators of growing extremism in this country. The second danger is that governments is governments. I'm a follower of Ibn Khaldun. I mentioned Ibn Khaldun is a 14th century Arab scholar. He says, very interesting quote from Ibn Khaldun. He said, governments are as a rule unjust. And I believe him. Governments are as a rule unjust. So I would vote for the least unjust government. I think unfortunately that's what we are faced with. And if we look at the history of, at least of the Islamic world, it is true. Most governments in Islamic history have been unjust. Even those governments that were in existence during the so-called golden age of Islam, when Islamic culture and science flourished. But the governments during those days were quite terrible in terms of abuses, in terms of torturing, in terms of corruption, and so on and so forth. So the second danger that we have in Malaysia today is that we have governments that are more interested in winning points with the electorate rather than solving pressing problems. And along with that, a lack of professionalism in the civil service due to the preponderance of political interests and ideological conflicts in the governance of our country. Third problem, not discussed enough and not discussed in a calm and academic manner, Christian extremism. I'm referring to the more extremist versions of evangelism. Again, not discussed, and I believe a growing problem, and not unconnected with the rise of the Christian right elsewhere in the world. Fourthly, market fundamentalism. The gradual encroachment of market values that are replacing religious values or other cultural values. So you see, religious fundamentalisms or extremisms, whether it's Muslim or Christian, along with market fundamentalism that tends to obliterate spiritual values, that tends to replace our religious and spiritual and cultural values with market logic, tends to reduce everyone to digits, that tends to put a premium on values like efficiency, predictability, calculability. This is a dangerous cocktail of fundamentalisms. Now, as far as Muslims are concerned, they are not analyzing their own problem of Muslim extremism. They have no understanding of Christian fundamentalism. And for all the discussions on Islamic economy that have been going on in the last 30-40 years in this country, there's been no proper analysis of capitalism or more recently of market fundamentalism, of the neo-liberal movement in political economy, which is a global movement. Right? So these are our problems. They are enormous problems. It is very unlikely that anything is going to be done about these problems, because in our universities and in our think tanks, particularly our universities, the atmosphere, the academic atmosphere and the academic culture is such that it is unlikely that people are going to be able to devote time and attention to these problems unless there's a serious change in the academic and political culture of our country. Thank you very much.